If you love liberty, declare your independence by signing the Shire Society Declaration at shiresociety.com.
Representative Josh Yoklef.
Thank you very much. This is just full, some studies and the full report from Massachusetts.
And then one copy of this?
Yes, one copy of this, and then I'm going to pass out the executive summary for what's in one of those. Since it's much shorter.
Perfect. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So one is an executive summary of commission report. I won't have to give you all 50 pages. So. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee members, for hearing my testimony today. This bill is proposing to switch to Atlantic time zone and opt out of daylight savings time. Some other states have tried to go to daylight savings time all year round, like Florida and California, but it would take an act of Congress for that to be allowed, and so switching time zones and opting out of daylight savings time would essentially have that same effect without needing an act of Congress, which may not come very soon. But the benefits have been demonstrated of doing so, so moving sooner rather than later is preferred. In 2017, Massachusetts did a special commission on the Commonwealth's time zone. I gave an entire copy of that report to the chair and gave you all the executive summary of what they found in that commission. They found increases in economic growth, productivity, decreases in on-the-job injuries and reduced severity of on-the-job injuries, reduced traffic fatalities, heart attacks, energy costs, and greenhouse emissions. The concerns that they had with switching was if one state did it, they would be the traffic and interstate commerce between those states would be a problem, and so they recommended going as a group of states. So this proposal will move New Hampshire to Atlantic time zone when Massachusetts and Maine also agree to make that move. So we wouldn't be doing it independently. We're taking that recommendation to move as a group. So there have been lots of demonstrated issues with the lack of sleep or sleep deprivation or seasonal affective disorder. Those happen all over the country. when we switch from daylight savings time and back and forth. But New Hampshire has an additional, and our region has an additional issue because we essentially go into an evening commute, which is in the dark, which other states, like even in the Eastern time zone, like Florida and stuff like that, when they fall back in November, or they are still falling back at a time that is 5:30 sunset, and so they are still having that commute during the day, in daylight, which some of the studies which I gave to the chairman show that the daylight commute reduces the amount of accidents with animals because they're more active at night, and it's harder to see them. Also with pedestrians, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is significant benefits to wildlife, to reduce car accidents, to a great number of things. One of the issues that was suggested and drawbacks could be if school time still started very early in the morning and before the sun rose. And so the commission found that they would recommend that schools have a start time of no later than 8:30 in the morning. And there are studies that show that having later start times is more effective for children anyways. So that I would definitely recommend, but I did not put that in the bill as a requirement that schools start at a specific time. I just think that it would be something that couldn't be expressed to superintendents and districts, and that they can make the choice that's best for them and their situation based on their schooling district. This is really a bipartisan issue. Massachusetts has a bill in this year, which is proposed by a Democratic senator. I believe that the representative from Connecticut gave you testimony regarding this. He is a Republican, and so it's really, the benefits are really shown, and people just want to move because of seeing those benefits. So I definitely think that we should indicate that we would like to join Massachusetts and Maine in this endeavor, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
And just one quick for the record, I received an email yesterday from Senator Hennessy. Dear Representative Goley, I'm writing to explain that I was inadvertently listed by OLS as a co-sponsor of House Bill 567, which you will be hearing. It was too late for them to remove my name when I learned that I was listed as a co-sponsor. I'm not taking a position on this bill, but I do want you to know that I had no intention of being listed as a co-sponsor. So just for the record, that was received, and I know OLS has had problems with sponsors on bills because I know I've been dropped on a few and other people have as well. So that's just for the record. And questions?
And I'd like to thank my friend for taking the questions that we're about to throw on you.
Yeah.
So, as you mentioned, Massachusetts and Connecticut, I did a little research, and it appears that other New England states have legislation that's filed similar to this, in the sense of, if this state does this and this state does that, we're going to do this.
Right.
As it does say in this legislation, if Massachusetts and Maine agree,
Absolutely.
then New Hampshire will follow suit. But it seems like with all the New England states all using similar language, would it be, and I don't even know how you could go down this road, but would it make sense to you it seems like the 6 New England states have to get together and have a commission, not just New Hampshire have one, and to look at this and Maine to look at the, you see what I'm getting at? Would it make more sense that the 6 New England states get together and come up with something unilaterally?
I'm not sure that another commission would be advised, as I stated in my written testimony, because the commission is just there to find out the information and research on the studies, and you can get a copy of it and look at all of the footnotes. The research isn't going to change. It's just whether or not a specific state wants to be in or out of that. And most of these proposals are based on who they have most economic and trade ties with. So Connecticut doesn't include New Hampshire in theirs, and Massachusetts does, and a lot of what I've heard is that a lot of people have economic ties with Massachusetts. So they seem to all just require that Massachusetts make the move. If Massachusetts makes the move, then other states will follow, including states like Vermont. Massachusetts' proposal this year does not include Vermont, but I would find it very unlikely that if Massachusetts moved, that Vermont wouldn't consider doing the same, even though I don't think that they've ever proposed moving to Atlantic time zone. But, and so I think that having a commission to decide, even if all of the, let's say all of the states except for Massachusetts decided that they didn't want to, Massachusetts decides that they want to, I think that will change the cost-benefit analysis of not being on that, especially since all of our TV stations, a lot of the TV stations come out of there, and they would be advertising, hey, we're not changing our time clock back, and that might be confusing to other people in this area. And so I think that as long as we stick with the contingency that when Maine moves, we move, that it will be beneficial. I don't think that we need to necessarily agree that Vermont does it if we're doing it, kind of a thing, because we have such strong ties with Massachusetts.
Sure.
So.
Okay, just a quick follow-up. So then, with the way that this is written, as it ties the decision making of the state of New Hampshire to decision making, in essence, of Maine and Massachusetts.
Right.
With what you're saying here is that if I'm getting you right, that Massachusetts is holding all the cards here, in essence, because everybody seems to be tied to the decision of Massachusetts to go to the Atlantic time zone or not, and then the dominoes seem to fall after?
Yes.
Okay.
And so the proposal from Massachusetts this year does include New Hampshire and Maine and Rhode Island. And so they did not include Connecticut or Vermont. And so we wouldn't necessarily want to be left behind. And I think that with the evidence of the commission's report, I think that it's clear that we could indicate, yes, we've seen the evidence and we agree with your findings on this.
All right.
Thank you. This has been a confusing subject for many, many years on how it started, when it started, why it started, etc. I get that we're trying to change two things. We're trying to move out of our current Eastern Standard Time to Atlantic Time, and we're trying to do away with daylight savings time, right? And we can't just opt out of daylight savings time.
No, we can't. We can opt out of daylight savings time. What this is essentially proposing is to have daylight savings all year around, because which is not currently allowed by the federal government. And so by switching time zones and opting out of daylight savings time for a majority of the year, 9 months of the year, we would be the exact same time as the Eastern time zone. It would only affect when the other states fall back.
No, thank you.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for testifying.
Absolutely.
So, moving to Atlantic time zone does not prohibit a state also doing daylight savings time.
Right.
So therefore, is that we could have a situation within New England, if they all go together, one state can opt into daylight savings time, to still put us out of sync. There's nothing to guarantee they're all going to be in the same time zone, if you will, year round. Even though we're in the same time zone, in the time zone here, doesn't mean a state within that block could opt for daylight savings time themselves.
So in the future, yes, they would be able, I mean, it would be legal for them to opt into daylight savings time and be an entire hour always ahead of Eastern time zone that is opt into daylight savings time. That is a possibility, but I'm not sure that it would be beneficial because of the way the sun works. So just, it's possible.
Yes, thank you. So I'm just going to understand this clarification question.
Yeah.
So Indiana is always in their own time zone. They don't fall back and they don't fall forward. I mean, go forward, right? They always stay in. They don't change times.
Indiana, there's the ones that I am aware of
Yeah.
are Hawaii
Yeah.
and Arizona. I didn't check Indiana.
Okay,
To see
I
if
do
they've
believe,
opted out.
I think that they have, but let's just use the example
Okay.
of this, you have a business trip in Indiana,
Okay.
and you fly into, and we're gonna pretend that we're Indiana, so New Hampshire, well, let's just use the example that New Hampshire's never gonna change their time zone, they're gonna stay in this Atlantic time. So we don't follow this, fall back, spring forward thing.
Yeah.
So if somebody has a visit, an appointment in New Hampshire,
Mm-hmm.
and it is in the time, it is the time of the year where Massachusetts falls back, right? And we haven't changed our time. Somebody would fly into Boston at like 3 o'clock,
Sure.
and if their appointment was in 3 o'clock in New Hampshire, they could actually technically make it because they, right?
So that would be a proposal that is not on the table right now because we're talking about only moving if.
Right, exactly.
So.
Exactly, okay, so you're not.
So,
okay.
so this is contingent on Massachusetts and Maine moving. So that wouldn't actually, that would be a different legislation.
Right, okay, all right. So we're just proposing that we will do this only if Maine and New Hampshire, and Massachusetts and Maine do it.
Yes.
Okay.
But your point is well taken for
I'm just trying, this
There are
is
some
like in
states
other
that have
parts of
that
the
done.
country
that has happened, and I have heard anecdotal evidence about someone saying, oh, I'm gonna be late to a delivery in Arizona, and they're like, no, I have another hour because it's gonna change as soon as I get in Arizona.
right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does the bill, is it an automatic trigger? If we pass it and Massachusetts passes it, do we automatically, as of that date, how's that supposed to work?
So I worked on the contingencies for this. So that is, I believe, section 3 of the bill. The contingencies. So the contingency is if they submit similar legislation and then a kind of cascade of effects happen. So we're not actually allowed to move time zones. We have to request from the Department of Transportation to move time zones and submit evidence and stuff like that. So the proposal is that once they go into effect, then as a group, essentially, we will request to the Department of Transportation to switch us to a time zone, Atlantic time zone. And then there's a separate contingency for part one, which is to go on the same effective date or essentially in the middle of summer, which would have no change to the time clocks because we would be in daylight savings time at that time.
So just to be clear, you won't have to come back before us. Once they do it, it's
Automatic
takes life
trigger.
of its own. And
Well, it's just contingent on them passing it, and it's based on their effective dates and when the different contingencies happen.
good. Okay, thanks.
Representative Merchant.
Thank you, Chair. For clarification, this needs to also be approved then by the Department of Transportation. So therefore, even though the states passed the law, it can't become effective until the U.S. Department of Transportation, in fact, signs off on it.
Right. So you're not allowed to switch time zones because of how time zones actually started with transportation in between states being, apparently they have the final say, and that is addressed in the commission report, and this is how you are going to have to switch time zones. Given that we have significant evidence and the fact that, you know, the daylight and stuff like that, conditions in New England, I don't believe that they would deny it, but it's, yes.
Representative Phelps.
Have you discussed this proposal with any school representatives, school boards, superintendents?
As regard to the time to start school, I did not. I've mentioned it to superintendents, but I didn't go into the detail of whether or not it was they were be in favor of a 8:30 time start time.
Thank you.
I guess.
Any questions? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
Chair calls Representative Carol McGuire.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Carol McGuire, representing the Merrimack District 29, which is Allenstown, Eastham, and Pittsfield. I had a similar bill in the previous session, which was approved by the House. Died in the Senate because I'm not sure why, but one of the reasons was they didn't want to be seen doing what Massachusetts did. So that's, you know, nice for your policy, but with 100,000 New Hampshire residents working in Massachusetts, being on a different time zone would be uncomfortable, to say the least. The reason that we're trying to do this is partly to avoid the spring forward, fall back, because that change is well known to be dangerous. There's lots of data in the report. It causes accidents, it causes sleep disruptions. And the reason to go to Atlantic time is because of the asymmetry of our clocks. There are a lot more people out and about at 6 p.m. than at 6 a.m. So in order to have afternoon daylight, we're willing to let it be dark in the afternoon, in the morning, and hope that that's, you know, we're so far north that it's going to be dark one or the other in the middle of the winter, no question about it. We'd rather have it be dark in the morning. And if you look at a map, you'll notice that New England is not only north, it's significantly further east than most of the eastern time zone. So it would be much more comfortable for us to be on, you know, an hour ahead of the sun, because we don't let the sun fool us. But it is nicer to have daylight when you're out and about than when you're sleeping. And the reason Indiana is such a problem is that I believe it's county by county in Indiana, whether they go to daylight savings time or not, so it's always a mess. But most of the country lives with time zone boundaries. We've got 5 time zones, you know, you get used to it. You know, it's a different time in Chicago than it is, you know, elsewhere. And nobody, you learn to deal with it. It's not a big deal. But if you're working in Massachusetts, if a lot of people in Massachusetts are coming to New Hampshire for their vacations, which is what happens all summer and all winter, we don't want to be on a different time. And so the point of this is that when Massachusetts decides, this is to encourage Massachusetts to make a smart decision, and then we'll go along with it. So I hope that you will support it. I plan to, and I'll answer whatever questions I have.
Questions?
I just like to say to Representative McGuire, I'm going to enjoy Red Sox games on the West Coast starting at midnight if this passes.
Nothing is perfect.
It'll be okay. You'll get over it.
Besides, they live at home, not on the road.
Thank you.
They make VCRs for
Chair calls Representative Chris Schultz.
Mr. Chair and committee, I don't think it's normal. It's not an every bill thing for a committee member to jump from the table and come testify. But I grew up in one of the states that has multiple time zones. 26 years of my life, I thought maybe this experience would be helpful. And I did look it up. Here are all the states that have more than one time zone. Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, North and South Dakota, Florida, Michigan, Indiana, Tennessee, Alaska, and Kentucky, where I grew up. And I grew up on the western edge of the eastern time zone. It's really nice. Even at Christmas time, it's light out till like 6 o'clock. Of course, we're closer to the equator in the city, but it definitely made a difference when I moved here because I now have seasonal affective disorder, and maybe it wouldn't be so bad if we switched to that. But really, I'm saying this and wanted to speak not because of that, but because it's really not that, it sounds complicated because you're not used to it. It's like a lot of things in life. You know, we have one really easy way to adapt to it, and that's clocks are everywhere. Whether you have a smartphone or a dumb phone, clocks in airports, for example. Like I flew for Christmas time, I got diverted through Chicago. So I was in the eastern zone, and then I switched to the central zone, and then when I landed at my next flight, it was in the eastern zone. It's not that hard. You have a phone, you have a watch, you have clocks. It just sounds different and difficult because we haven't experienced it before. And in that sense, I just wanted to say, like, how do all these states deal with it then? I worked, my first jobs out of college were in Kentucky. I worked for the Kentucky Democratic Party on some elections. And the polls closed at one half of the state at 6 o'clock, and then in the central time zone at 6 o'clock. And it was bipartisan because it happened with the Republicans too. And it really is just something you're used to. You know, drive a half an hour south from Louisville, and then you're in the central time zone. You just know that's how it is. Plus they put signs on the highways. And if we're willing to do this with other states' participation, a lot of the perceived difficulties would go away. People who travel a lot for work, they're doing this all the time. It's not rocket science. It's simple. It's just a simple matter of clocks. There's a lot more I could say, but I will add this point, because the school time didn't change for us in the western part of the eastern time zone. And all the bus stops have lighted areas. It wasn't a big deal, but it was nice to come home and still have that many more, to have that extra sunny time for your personal time was really nice. So anyway, as someone who grew up in this situation, thought maybe people might have a question or two.
Questions?
Yes,
Well, anyway.
Mr. Chair.
Son Judy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, can you give me an example about when it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and in Kentucky, what time it is there?
Right now, it's also 3 o'clock in the eastern half of the state, but it's 2 o'clock in the other half of the state. Yeah, it's just normal. Yeah, part of the, completely half of the state is in the central time zone currently.
So
And it's the same for Tennessee as well.
1 hour difference or?
Yeah, just an hour.
Thank you.
Quick question.
Sure.
I mean, we're talking time zones here.
Yeah,
Here we're talking about those states still do daylight savings time, correct?
True.
So that's not comparing the same because they're going backwards 4 months out of the year where we wouldn't be. So we wouldn't be like comparing one time zone to another time zone. That's central to.
That's correct. But living in areas with that close of a line was just no big deal. I mean, whether you have a smartphone or not, we have access to clocks. And if anything, the research shows ditching daylight savings time would be healthy for everybody. I don't want to double what Representative McGuire said, but the research, there's no decent reason to have daylight savings time, which I think is the purpose of the bill when it was originally presented a few years ago, was to ditch daylight savings time because it's healthier to not have it. So you're right in what you said, and why I wanted to speak is because we have that difference right there, you know, where I grew up. And many states deal with that. So it would just be something you would have to deal with twice a year, just like we do already, but only in the consciousness of when we cross a border.
Did you just say you were okay with ditching daylight savings time?
Yes,
So you're for the bill?
yes.
Okay, because I was really confused.
Really? I feel like I was being very strongly in support of the bill.
I was pretty sure you were against it until you said that.
Thank you. Right?
Thank you. So to follow up again the question, if we elect to be down this road, and given the fact we have such close ties with the state of Massachusetts, and we're now in the same time zone called the Atlantic time zone, if they decide to go to daylight savings time for whatever reason, what would we do?
It'd be the same as any other situation where you have a difference. You know, like all the examples I listed before. Like if you fly from one airport to the other, you know the time has changed. There are signs on the highways. There are certainly clocks at airports. Any place where you would go that has an entry to that area, maybe with the exception of a boat, I guess, you would just know by signs and you would adapt like we already do. I don't know, I mean, I haven't experienced that specifically, but, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is. You just have to adapt. Not rocket science.
So sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I recall when the previous bill came up, that a point was made that some of the schools on the extreme western border of New Hampshire, students go to school actually in Vermont, and the point was made that if New Hampshire's time changed, it could work difficulties for the families that are sending their kids to school for different clock times in Vermont. I'm curious, when you went to school in Kentucky, did you go to school in the same time zone as where you were living?
Yes, and so I can't say what
So
that
you
is.
didn't have to.
Sure, they would have to adapt. Yeah. I mean, that's a good point. Yeah, they would know when they go to school, it's a different time.
If you don't mind me bouncing off of that, if I'm thinking the math or the time zone correct, in the case of Vermont, it would, if the Vermont school started at 7 a.m., it would be 8 a.m. in New Hampshire, right? Or am I
Yes,
backwards?
you're right.
Okay, so I don't know that that would be necessarily a disadvantage in the sense that they wouldn't have to wake up earlier because we would be an hour ahead of them. I suppose that if the Vermont children were going to school in New Hampshire, that would be worse
Yes,
than it would be for the other way.
yes.
So I don't know that I don't know if that's necessarily a disadvantage
Well, and
for New Hampshire students that happen to go to Vermont for school.
That's true. And I would also say there are people who work at just south of Fort Knox that travel to Louisville for work, and because the time zone line is right there, they have to know that there's an hour difference between where they live and where they work.
Yeah, follow up that. It was mentioned that by I think the previous person that 9 months out of the year we would match the Eastern time zone, in 3 months. I'm just looking for clarification to make sure I've got this correct. 3 months out of the year we would be in Atlantic distinctly.
6 months.
Or is it 6 months?
Long time.
Whatever it is, April to November, whenever the change
We
happens.
would have a 6-month difference in time zones if folks stayed with daylight savings time in other states. And we did not and adopted this bill. That's correct. So 6 months roughly.
Or March to November,
Yeah.
whenever the clocks change.
Yes.
Okay.
Other questions? Seeing none.
So I just want to make clear, I am for this bill. I never knew I was so vague about it.
Chair calls Garrett Ian. Supporting the bill.
Thank you for your time today. My name is Garrett Ian, representing myself. I'm from Concord. Time itself is such a powerfully multifaceted concept. It's amazing to consider how much the documentation and measurement of time has advanced human civilization and evolution. Its measurement is an intrinsic part of every aspect of human culture on Earth and reflects regional distinctions, and in the case of the United States, an unnatural government bending of the will of our clocks. More than a generation before almost everyone alive today was born, a decision was made by folks in a position of authority who probably should have known better, and for questionable reasons, to alter our measurement of time in a perpetually shifting way. When we consider how natural our measurement of time would be without the government, we can recognize the daylight savings time concept as the anomaly to our functioning natural system that it is. When the United States was originally formed, the founders convened standards for weights, measurements, currency, but time was already so enough culturally ingrained that it wasn't necessary to standardize and mandate a coordinated system in this country for that. Since 1967, Arizona has been free of daylight savings time clock shifting. Hawaii has been since 1945, which is well before it was a state. It's no wonder that so many folks would want to retire to Arizona, considering that you're not messing with your clocks and that the clock shifting is said to affect the elderly most severely, because increases in strokes, increases in heart attacks that occur along daylight savings time, obviously most severely impact the elderly. Increases in traffic accidents have been documented, general sleep disorders have been documented around the specific times in which the clocks are changed. And there's just nothing natural about forcibly shifting our bodies to a different time than the sun and the earth and the universe is at. So the bill presented creates a wonderful opportunity for New Hampshire, Maine, and Massachusetts, recognizing the existing cultural ties of coastal northeastern New England, to reallow time to be measured in a natural, cyclical fashion as it does in the true physical realm. As the sun does not suddenly jump backwards in the sky, our measurement of its movements should not do that either. As a person who is more inclined to be active in the evenings, I prefer more hours of sunshine in the evenings in the winter, but whether it's ultimately decided to stick to EST or with no clock shifts or permanent Atlantic Standard Time with no clock shifts, I think the important thing to take from the bill is that we try to lead the nation in stopping this idea of messing with the clocks, as Arizona and Hawaii have been way ahead of us on. It's a disruption programmed into our lives that is unnecessary, that we have good reason and purpose to alleviate with our neighbors to the west and to the south. And it's an incredible chance for New Hampshire to lead the nation against what was an incredible mistake with, it seemed minuscule but has major consequences. And can help return regularity, consistency, and harmony to our lives where we unnecessarily disrupt it. I thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Questions?
I guess one more point I would just make is if you look at a lot of the time zones on the map of the United States, there's places where like little corners of states aren't within the time zone of the rest of the state. And you would think that would be confusing because it's within the same state, shouldn't it be the same thing? But I think in Indiana as an example, like the Chicago metropolitan area is northwestern Indiana. The northwestern corner of Indiana has more ties to Chicago than it does to the remainder of Indiana, so it makes sense for them to be on Chicago time. And I'd say Boston is the same with New Hampshire. Boston is this region's major metropolitan area, so the fact that Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts are the three in this pact makes the most sense. If Vermont wanted to join, that's great, but if you think of it, they're west of us. So their advantage would be slightly less than ours as to the east getting the earlier sunshine. Thank you.
Can we have a copy of your testimony for the record?
I just have this one page. If you'd like, I can show you.
Thank you. Thank you. And the chair calls Will Anderson.
My name is Will Anderson. I'm from Concord, and I am in support of this bill. Thank you for hearing my testimony. A lot of the previous people giving testimony were addressing a lot of the more technical aspects of this bill and why it would be logical to switch to Atlantic time. I would like to go more from a personal perspective. I have a friend who also lives in Concord who would have loved to have been here, but unfortunately her work schedule didn't allow her to be here. So I'd like to basically not testify on her behalf, but share a personal story as far as her. So she has a young daughter who's a 6-year-old, and so the twice-a-year switching of time zones here greatly disrupts her daughter's schedule and consequently her as well. It might be more obvious that in the spring when we jump forward, that would be a disadvantage, where it would be harder for her daughter to wake up in the morning, and then consequently she'd want to stay up later in the evening, which happens. But it's as much of a disadvantage in the fall when we go back as well, because she gets tired earlier in the evening, wants to go to bed earlier, and consequently tends to get up earlier in the morning, which hurts her mother as well because it disrupts her sleep schedule too. So the consistency of having the same time all year round would be of great benefit to her, and I imagine, like, she's not a unique case. I imagine, like, a lot of children like consistency in schedules. So I think this would be you know, a great benefit to children and the parents as well, in not having to disrupt their schedules with the twice-a-year time shift. I'll take any questions. Okay.
That's the last pink card I have for House Bill 567. Anybody else out there who wishes to testify? Anything else to comment on? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing on House Bill 567.
We'd like to invite you to visit freekeen.com. Freekeen.com features audio, video, and blogs chronicling the transition to a voluntary society. Freekeen.com also has comments and discussion forums so you can be heard. Freekeen.com.
I should be in Keene, New Hampshire with the Free Staters.